What happens when a group of racist bullies target the wrong black man, mistaking his quiet demeanor and size for weakness? Watch as a retired Marine refuses to be intimidated and fights back against a racist gang determined to control a small town. The dusty heat of the afternoon sun was relentless as Mac Davis stepped out of his battered pickup truck. A man of considerable size, Mac carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, his broad shoulders and barrel chest marking him as someone not to be trifled with. His Marine Corps cap sat snugly on his head, shielding his eyes from the glare as he took in the small town's quiet streets. This was supposed to be his fresh start, a place far removed from the chaos he had left behind in the city. He had just moved into town 2 days ago, settling into a modest house on the outskirts. His plan was simple: teach fitness at the community center, enjoy the peace, and let life slow down for once. But as Mac walked toward the diner at the edge of town, he couldn't ignore the subtle stares from passers-by. They weren't overtly hostile, but they lingered too long, their curiosity thinly veiling judgment. The diner itself was a relic of the past, with its neon open sign flickering against the backdrop of sun-bleached walls. Inside, it smelled of fried food and coffee, a mix that should have been comforting but felt oddly tense. Mac slid into a booth near the window, appreciating the quiet. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, approached cautiously, her smile polite but wary. "Coffee?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Please," Mac replied, his deep voice calm and steady. "And whatever special you've got." She nodded, retreating quickly. Mac didn't think much of it. He was used to being underestimated because of his size, his presence often misinterpreted as a threat. He adjusted the Marine Corps ring on his finger, letting his thoughts drift as he waited for his meal. The bell above the diner door jingled, breaking the calm. 3 men strolled in, their loud laughter cutting through the muted conversations. Mac glanced up briefly. The leader, a wiry man with a cocky swagger, caught his eye and smirked. The other 2 followed closely, their movements deliberate, their confidence unmistakable. The leader's voice rang out, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Well, would you look at that?" he drawled, nodding toward Mac. "Big guy thinks he can take over our booth." Mac's grip tightened on his coffee cup. So much for a fresh start. The atmosphere in the diner shifted the moment Derek and his gang stepped in. Conversations that had filled the space only moments ago dwindled to whispers, replaced by the cocky cadence of Derek's voice. Mac had seen men like him before, loud, arrogant, and deeply insecure beneath the bravado. He kept his eyes down, stirring his coffee and hoping they'd pass by. But luck wasn't on his side. Derek, wiry but quick on his feet, approached Mac's booth with exaggerated steps, his smirk growing wider with every stride. His 2 companions, Jake and Evan, trailed close behind, their grins matching Derek's like shadows, mimicking their master. The 3 men loomed over Mac's table, their presence casting an unwelcome shadow. "Hey, big guy," Derek said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Didn't know the circus was in town." Mac didn't look up, calmly taking another sip of his coffee. He'd learned long ago not to rise to the bait. Silence, after all, was often the best way to disarm a fool. But Derek wasn't looking for silence. He wanted a reaction. "What's the matter?" Jake chimed in, his tone just as grating. "Too busy counting calories to say hi." The 2 men burst into laughter, while Evan leaned against the booth, pretending to inspect Mac's plate. "Man, with all that weight, you must have been first in line when they served breakfast," Evan sneered. "Or maybe second, third, and fourth." Mac's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He picked up his fork and cut into the diner's special, a chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes, and began eating slowly, deliberately. The calmness in his movements seemed to irritate Derek. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Derek snapped, slapping his hand on the table. The sound reverberated through the room, and a hush fell over the diner. Mac slowly raised his eyes, his expression neutral, though his grip on the fork betrayed a flicker of tension. I didn't realize this was your booth, Max said evenly, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority. You want it? Take it. I'm just here to eat. Derek's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Nah, I'm good standing right here. Gives me a better view of… He gestured vaguely at Mac's body. Whatever this is. Man, how do you even fit through doors? Jake and Evan burst into laughter again, nudging each other like schoolyard bullies. The waitress, standing by the counter, glanced nervously in their direction but made no move to intervene. Max set down his fork and leaned back in his seat, his eyes meeting Derek's for the first time. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet, simmering patience. Are you done? He asked simply. Derek's grin turned into a sneer. Done? Oh, not even close. I mean, come on. Look at you. Big guy like you, I bet you don't even work. Just sit around all day stuffing your face, huh? Jake added, Bet he's on disability or something. Probably milking the system. Mac's fingers curled into a fist under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. His training had taught him restraint, to pick his battles wisely. This wasn't about him. It was about the small-mindedness of men who needed to tear others down to feel tall. He wasn't going to let them win by stooping to their level. Why don't you go sit down and enjoy your lunch? Max said evenly, his voice calm but firm. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. Derek laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the diner. End? What's that supposed to mean? You threatening me, fat boy? Jake and Evan stepped closer, their grins fading into something more predatory. The air in the diner felt heavier now, charged with tension. A few patrons shifted in their seats, watching the scene unfold but doing nothing to intervene. The waitress disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Mac alone with the gang. Derek leaned in, his face inches from Mac's. I don't think you get it, Tubby. This is our town. You don't belong here. So why don't you finish your meal, waddle on out, and never come back? Mac didn't flinch. His voice was steady, his words measured. I belong wherever I decide to be, and I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, the diner was silent, the weight of Mac's words hanging in the air. Derek's smirk faltered again, and he took a small step back, as if surprised by the confidence radiating from the man before him. But the moment didn't last. Jake broke the silence with a derisive snort. You hear that, Derek? Big guy's got a backbone. Let's see if it can hold up his weight. The laughter started again, louder this time, more aggressive. Mac's patience was wearing thin. He glanced at his plate, then at Derek and his crew, calculating his next move. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the diner was palpable. Every patron acutely aware of the unfolding confrontation, but unwilling to intervene. Derek stepped back just enough to survey the room, as if soaking in the silent approval of his audience. He turned his attention back to Mac, smirking as he tapped a finger on the table. You're new around here, aren't you? Derek asked, his voice dropping into a mockingly friendly tone. See? We don't get many like you in this town. Mac kept his gaze steady. Like me? He asked, his tone calm but edged with steel. Derek's smirk widened, his eyes scanning Mac from head to toe. Yeah, you know, big city types. Real different. You stand out. Don't take it the wrong way, though. It's just that people like you don't really, fit in around here. Jake leaned against the booth, crossing his arms with a smug grin. He means black. Don't worry, man. We'll spell it out for you if it's too hard to follow. Evan snickered, adding, Yeah, folks like you don't last long here. They always seem to pack up and leave real quick. Wonder why that is. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as their words hung in the air. Mac's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles whitening. He knew this wasn't about him personally. It never was. Men like Derek thrived on making others feel unwelcome, on reinforcing the idea that they had ownership over spaces that didn't belong to them. Mac let the silence linger, his calm demeanor unshaken. You're real brave with three of you and a crowd to cheer you on, he said finally, his voice low, but cutting through the room like a blade. Is this what you do for fun? Drive people out because you can't handle the thought of someone different? Derek's grin twisted into something darker. Nah, we just like keeping our town clean. Know what I mean? Can't have people like you lowering property values. Jake laughed loudly at that, slapping Derek on the back. Derek's doing this town a service. Call him a community leader. Evan, emboldened by their laughter, jabbed a finger toward Mac. Bet you don't even work. You probably came here looking for handouts. Let me guess. Disability checks? Food stamps? Maybe a little Section 8? Mac clenched his jaw but stayed seated, refusing to rise to their bait. His calm unnerved them, even if they didn't show it. Men like Derek wanted chaos. They thrived on it. They wanted him to explode, to give them an excuse to escalate. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. You don't know a thing about me, Mac said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Derek's. But keep talking. You're telling me plenty about yourself. Derek's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained it, leaning closer again. Oh, we know enough. Guys like you don't belong here. You think you can just show up and… what? Pretend you're one of us? Nah. This is our town, our rules, and people who don't like it? Well, they figure it out real quick. Jake nodded in agreement. Yeah, we make sure of it. Ain't that right, Derek? Damn right, Derek said, straightening up and puffing out his chest. See, when people like you show up, we remind them they're not welcome. Some get the hint after a few days. Others need a little more persuasion. Mac's calm demeanor cracked just enough for a flicker of anger to show in his eyes. He'd faced ignorance and prejudice before, but this was something else. These men weren't just bullies. They were a system. A coordinated effort to keep people of color out of their town through fear and intimidation. What's the plan? Mac asked coolly. You think you're going to intimidate me into leaving? You're wasting your time. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Man, you don't get it, do you? This isn't a choice. We've been here a long time. You're just passing through. It's best you remember that. Derek stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a growl. Or maybe you need a little demonstration to make it clearer. The threat was unmistakable, and the tension in the room reached a breaking point. The other diners looked on, their faces a mix of fear and resignation. No one moved to help. No one dared to intervene. You want to make your point? Mac asked, slowly standing from his booth. His full height dwarfed Derek, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure. Go ahead and try, but I'll warn you now. You won't like the outcome. Derek's bravado flickered, but Jake and Evan stepped in to back him up, forming a wall of overconfidence. The smirks returned, their arrogance unwavering. They thought they had him outnumbered, that their strength lay in their numbers. Derek cracked his knuckles. Let's see what you've got, fat boy. Mac didn't flinch. His stance was solid, his expression calm. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Derek smirked, stepping closer. What's the matter, big guy? You scared? Or are you just too slow to do anything about it? Jake and Evan flanked him, their postures tense but cocky, like predators toying with prey. The diner's silence was deafening. No one dared to speak, the few remaining patrons frozen in their seats. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her face pale. Mac's voice cut through the charged air. You boys have made a mistake. You don't want this fight. Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the diner's tiled walls. You hear that? Fat boy thinks he's gonna teach us a lesson. He turned to Jake and Evan. Maybe we should teach him a little respect first. Jake cracked his knuckles and moved in first. Respect, huh? Let's see how much you've got. The swing came fast but uncoordinated. Mac ducked easily, sidestepping the blow and twisting his torso to deliver a calculated shove to Jake's chest. Jake staggered backward, crashing into a booth, his breath coming out in a startled wheeze. The plates on the table rattled as he grabbed for balance. You've got one chance to walk away, Mac said, straightening up, his voice calm but firm. Take it. But Derek wasn't listening. Fueled by embarrassment and rage, he lunged at Mac with surprising speed, aiming a wild punch at his face. Mac blocked it with his forearm, his other hand shooting forward to push Derek off balance. The smaller man stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair before catching himself. "You're gonna pay for that," Derek spat, his fists clenching. "Get him!" Evan hesitated. But with Derek's glare bearing down on him, he threw himself at Mac. This time, Mac caught him mid-lunge, grabbing the younger man's arm and twisting it gently but firmly. Evan yelped in pain, squirming in Mac's grip, before Mac released him with a controlled shove that sent him sprawling onto the floor. Jake pushed himself off the booth, red-faced and furious. "You think you're tough because you can throw us around. We'll see how tough you are when we knock you down." Jake and Derek moved in at the same time, attacking from different angles. Mac pivoted, ducking under Jake's punch and using his momentum to deliver a precise strike to Jake's ribs. Jake let out a grunt of pain, doubling over and clutching his side. Derek, meanwhile, managed to close the gap, slamming his shoulder into Mac's chest. The impact made Mac step back, but it wasn't enough to knock him down. Derek pressed the advantage, swinging again, this time with more force. Mac caught Derek's arm mid-swing, locking it in place. "You're out of your depth," Mac said, his voice low and steady. With a quick twist, he forced Derek's arm down, causing the smaller man to let out a sharp cry of pain. Evan, now back on his feet, grabbed a chair and swung it at Mac. The sudden movement caught Mac off guard, and the edge of the chair grazed his arm. The pain was fleeting, but it reignited Mac's focus. He turned to Evan, his eyes narrowing. "That's enough," Mac growled, his tone commanding. Evan froze, his hand still gripping the chair. For a moment, his bravado faltered, his gaze darting to Derek for reassurance. But Derek was still struggling to free himself from Mac's grip, his face contorted in anger and humiliation. "Don't just stand there, Evan," Derek shouted. "Hit him!" Mac released Derek with a sharp shove, sending him stumbling into Jake, who had just recovered. Both men glared at Mac, their confidence cracking but not yet broken. Evan dropped the chair, taking a cautious step back, clearly unsure of his next move. The standoff resumed, the gang circling Mac like wolves regrouping for another attack. Mac stood his ground, his breathing steady, his stance unshaken. He scanned their faces, noting the hesitation creeping into their eyes. "You've already lost," Mac said, his tone calm but cutting. "You just don't know it yet." Derek's fists clenched, his face red with frustration. "This isn't over," he spat, motioning for Jake and Evan to spread out again. "You think you can come here, humiliate us, and walk away? Not in our town." Mac's expression didn't change. "You've got one more chance. Walk away now, or you'll regret it." The tension was suffocating, the diner's silence broken only by the faint clatter of a fork hitting the floor. Derek's sneer faltered for just a moment, his resolve wavering as he took in Mac's unshaken confidence. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Get him!" he growled, his voice low and venomous. Mac shifted his weight slightly, bracing himself as the three men prepared to charge again. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Derek's grip on his pride, however, was slipping fast. His face twisted in frustration as he barked, "Get him!" His voice carried a venomous edge, but behind it was the unmistakable tremor of fear. Jake moved in first, charging clumsily. Max sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, using Jake's momentum against him. With a quick grab and shove, Max sent him sprawling into a nearby booth, the wooden frame creaking under the impact. Before Jake could react, Mac was already turning to face Evan. Evan hesitated, his fists half raised, his movements awkward. But Derek's angry shout propelled him forward. "Don't just stand there, you idiot!" Derek snapped. Evan lunged, his aim desperate and uncoordinated. Mac intercepted him mid-swing, gripping his arm firmly. With a fluid motion, Mac twisted and redirected Evan into the side of a table. Plates and glasses clattered to the floor as Evan let out a yelp, clutching his ribs. Derek's fury boiled over. He came at Mac head-on, fists flying. Mac blocked the first strike, dodged the second, and stepped in close. Grabbing Derek by his shirt collar, Mac hauled him off his feet and slammed him into the wall. The impact sent a framed picture tumbling to the floor, and Derek's bravado shattered along with it. Mac's voice was low and controlled. but the weight of his words pressed on Derek like a vice. "You done yet?" Derek squirmed, his eyes darting around the diner for help. Jake staggered to his feet, holding his side, while Evan leaned heavily against a booth, his face pale. Both men looked at Derek, their confidence thoroughly dismantled. "This isn't over," Derek spat, his voice cracking as Mac released him. He stumbled but managed to stay upright. "We know where to find you." Jake nodded, his voice slurring as he added, "Yeah, you're done. You don't belong here." Evan muttered something unintelligible, his eyes darting between the door and Derek, clearly eager to flee. Derek glared at Mac one last time, his trembling hand pointing at him like a curse. "You'll regret this. You'll see." The gang turned and bolted for the door, their retreat clumsy and disorganized. Derek shoved the door open, and the bell jingled violently as they stumbled outside. "We'll make you pay," Derek shouted over his shoulder before disappearing down the street. Mac stood in the center of the wrecked diner, his breathing steady as the adrenaline coursed through him. He surveyed the damage, overturned chairs, shattered plates, and the stunned faces of the remaining patrons. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her face pale but her eyes filled with cautious admiration. "Are you okay?" she asked hesitantly, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Mac replied, his deep voice calm but firm. "Call the police." "I already did," she said. "They're on their way." Moments later, the wail of sirens cut through the tension, growing louder until 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the diner. The officers stepped inside, their eyes darting from the wreckage to Mac. One officer, tall and stocky with a buzz cut, approached him cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What happened here?" the officer asked, his tone clipped and professional. Mac crossed his arms over his chest, meeting the officer's gaze steadily. "I defended myself." The waitress stepped forward, her voice hurried. "It wasn't his fault. Those guys, Derek and his friends, they started it. They've been causing trouble around here for years." The officer's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Derek's name, but he didn't relax. "You're new in town, right?" he asked Mac. Mac nodded. "Just moved here." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger man who looked uncomfortable as he surveyed the scene. "Derek's known to us," the first officer said cautiously. "But you seem to have made quite an impression." Mac's jaw tightened. He could hear the unspoken skepticism in the officer's tone, the subtle implication that the new guy must have done something to provoke the gang. "I didn't start this," Mac said firmly, "but I finished it." The waitress nodded vigorously. "He's telling the truth. Derek and his crew came in, started harassing him, and wouldn't stop. They've done this before. To other people." The officer sighed, running a hand over his buzzed hair. "Yeah, we've heard complaints about them. Hard to get anything to stick, though." Mac narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me they've been doing this for years, and no one stopped them?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We do what we can, but people around here don't like to talk. Derek's family has connections." Mac's gaze didn't waver. "Connections or not, they just threatened me." "You planning to do something about that?" The officer hesitated, then gestured toward the damage. "We'll file a report. If they come near you again, let us know." Mac's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He could see the reluctance in the officer's posture, the unspoken reality that Derek and his gang had been allowed to terrorize the town unchecked. As the officers began taking statements from the other patrons, Mac stepped outside. The cool air hit his face as he stood on the diner's steps, his thoughts racing. Derek's threats echoed in his mind. "We know where to find you." This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mac adjusted his Marine Corps cap and squared his shoulders. If the town wasn't going to stand up to Derek, then he would. One way or another, this was going to end. The diner was quieter now, but the tension lingered in the air like the aftermath of a storm. Mac walked toward his truck, his every step measured, his mind replaying the threats Derek had spat as he and his gang fled. He didn't doubt for a second that they'd make good on those threats. The bruises on his knuckles and the overturned chairs in the diner were only the beginning. Derek wasn't the type to let humiliation go unanswered. The police, unsurprisingly, had been dismissive. Their thin assurances of filing a report didn't fool Mac. He'd seen the way they shifted uncomfortably when Derek's name came up, their words laden with hesitation. The gang had connections, small-town ties that kept them untouchable. But Mac wasn't about to back down. That night, Mac sat in his modest living room, the Marine Corps cap resting on the coffee table. His laptop glowed in the dim light as he began his research. If Derek and his gang thought they could intimidate him into leaving, they'd underestimated the discipline of a man who'd endured far worse. He started with local news. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern. Vague reports of harassment, fights, and property damage, all attributed to Derek and his crew. Most accounts lacked names or detailed follow-ups, and the few victims who had spoken out quickly recanted their statements or moved away. The pieces began to fall into place. Derek and his gang weren't just a group of thugs, they were a system of intimidation. Their targets weren't random. They were people like Mac, outsiders, minorities, anyone who didn't fit the mold of their small-town ideal. The next morning, Mac headed to the community center where he'd just started work as a fitness coach. Between sessions, he spoke with some of the staff, careful to ease into the conversation. He learned more than he expected. One woman, a middle-aged receptionist named Sandra, was quick to warn him. "You're not the first," Sandra said, her voice low as she glanced around the room. "They've been doing this for years, threatening people, vandalizing property. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure folks like us don't get comfortable here." Mac leaned forward, his expression serious. "Why hasn't anyone done anything about it?" Sandra sighed, shaking her head. "People are scared. Derek's uncle is on the town council. His dad owns half the businesses in town, and the police," she hesitated, "they look the other way." Her words confirmed what Mac had suspected. The system in this town wasn't broken. It was rigged. Derek and his gang operated with impunity because the people in power allowed it. "Do you know anyone they've targeted recently?" Mac asked, his voice steady but edged with determination. Sandra nodded slowly. "There was a family, black couple with a teenage son. They moved here last year. Derek and his crew trashed their car, left threats on their porch. The family didn't stay long after that." Mac's jaw tightened. "Do you know how I can get in touch with them?" Sandra scribbled a name and number on a piece of paper. "They don't live here anymore, but they might talk to you. Just be careful. Derek's not going to stop. He'll try to scare you out of here." Mac gave her a firm nod. "He's welcome to try." That evening, Mac made the call. The voice on the other end was cautious at first, but when Mac explained who he was and what had happened at the diner, the man's tone shifted. He introduced himself as David Jackson and told Mac everything. "They targeted us the second we moved in," David said, his voice filled with frustration and lingering fear. "It started with stares, comments at the grocery store. Then it escalated. Slashed tires, graffiti on our garage. The police didn't do a damn thing. Derek's uncle? He was at one of their barbecues the same weekend they trashed our car." "Why didn't you press charges?" Mac asked, though he already knew the answer. "They made it clear what would happen if we did," David replied bitterly. "We've got a kid. We couldn't take the risk." The conversation left Mac more determined than ever. Derek and his gang thrived on fear, using it to keep their victims isolated and silent. But Mac wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to run. He spent the next few days gathering more evidence, speaking to others who had been targeted, and documenting everything meticulously. Each story painted a damning picture of a town that had allowed Derek and his crew to terrorize anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of belonging. Mac also made a point to keep an eye on his surroundings. Derek and his gang weren't idle. They'd driven by his house twice that week, their loud laughter carrying through the night air. But Mac didn't flinch. If they were going to come for him, he'd be ready. As the days passed, Mac's plan began to take shape. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to dismantle Derek's operation piece by piece, and this time, the town would have no choice but to pay attention. The evening air was crisp as Mac stood in his driveway, The faint glow of the town's streetlights casting long shadows. The past few days had been a whirlwind of whispers, cautious conversations, and pieced together stories. Derek and his gang weren't just bullies. They were predators, and the town had allowed them to thrive. Mac wasn't going to let that continue. He began his plan by focusing on the weakest link, Evan. The young man had been visibly shaken during the diner confrontation, his reluctance to escalate evident even when Derek barked orders. Evan didn't strike Mac as someone who wanted this life, just someone too scared to leave it. The opportunity came the following evening. Mac waited near the auto parts store where Evan worked, his truck parked inconspicuously nearby. When the lights inside dimmed and the lock clicked on the door, Mac approached. Evan froze when he spotted Mac stepping into the light. "What? What do you want?" Evan stammered, his voice cracking. "To talk," Mac said calmly, stopping a few feet away. His large frame loomed, but his tone remained steady, almost reassuring. "You've got a chance to do the right thing. Walk away from this." Evan laughed nervously, his hand fumbling with his keys. "You don't know Derek. You don't know what he'll do." "I know exactly what he'll do," Mac replied, "because I've dealt with men like him before, and they always fall. The only question is, are you going down with him?" Evan's shoulders slumped slightly. He glanced around the empty lot, then back at Mac. "What do you mean?" "Tell me everything you know. What he's done, where he operates, who's helping him." Mac's voice was firm but not aggressive. "You're scared of him, and I get that. But Derek's not going to protect you when this blows up in his face. You don't want to be standing next to him when it happens." Evan hesitated, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he muttered. "But you didn't hear it from me." The information Evan gave Mac opened the door to a much larger picture. Derek wasn't just targeting individuals. He and his gang had terrorized minority-owned businesses, vandalized properties, and threatened families to force them out of town. Worse, Derek's father, a wealthy local businessman, was quietly funding campaigns and keeping key figures in town on his payroll to shield his son. Mac pieced it all together, compiling every detail into a growing dossier. He spoke to more people who had been targeted, each story fueling his determination. Most were hesitant at first, glancing nervously over their shoulders as they talked. But Mac's presence, his quiet resolve, gave them courage. There was a black family who moved in 2 streets over, a neighbor whispered to him one afternoon. They only lasted a month. Derek and his friends smashed their car windows, spray-painted their garage. The police didn't do a thing. Another man at the community center shook his head bitterly as he recounted his story. "I run a small shop. Derek's crew started hanging out by my storefront, scaring off customers. I tried to file a complaint, but, well, nothing came of it." Mac documented it all. Each interview, each photo, each detail painted a damning picture of a town held hostage by fear and silence. One evening, Mac attended a town council meeting. He sat quietly in the back, blending into the crowd as the council discussed mundane issues, funding, infrastructure, and upcoming events. But when the floor opened for public comments, Mac stood. "My name is Mac Davis," he began, his deep voice carrying through the room. "I've only been here a short time, but I've seen enough to know this town has a problem." He held up a thick folder of evidence, his gaze sweeping over the council members. "For years, a group of individuals has been terrorizing residents, harassing businesses, vandalizing homes, and driving families out. And it's been allowed to continue because of silence." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. One of the council members, an older man with a stiff posture, shifted in his seat. "This isn't just about a group of bullies," Mac continued. "It's about a system that's protected them. I've spoken to people who've been targeted, people too afraid to come forward. But that fear ends now. I've sent this to the press, and I'll make sure it gets to the right authorities." Mac's gaze landed on a man sitting near the end of the table, Derek's uncle. The man's face was pale, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. Mac didn't need to say his name. The implication was clear. I'm not here to scare anyone, Mac finished. I'm here to make sure this stops, one way or another. The murmurs in the room grew louder as Mac stepped back, his presence lingering like a storm cloud. He didn't wait for a response. He'd said what needed to be said. The next night, as Mac stepped out of his truck in his driveway, headlights appeared down the street. A familiar car screeched to a halt, and Derek, Jake, and Evan spilled out, their faces twisted with anger. "You think you're smart?" Derek shouted, storming toward Mac. "You think you can ruin us?" Mac stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides. "I don't have to ruin you," he said calmly. "You've done that yourself." Jake cracked his knuckles, his voice shaky but loud. "You're dead, old man. This is our town." Evan lingered behind, his eyes darting nervously. Derek's glare snapped him out of it, and he stepped forward reluctantly. "You made your choice," Max said, his voice low. "And now, you're going to deal with the consequences." The three of them edged closer, their aggression barely masking their fear. Max squared his shoulders, ready for whatever came next. The night air felt heavier as Derek, Jake, and Evan advanced toward Mac, their faces twisted with anger. The tension in the quiet street was almost palpable, the glow of the headlights casting flickering shadows that danced across the ground. Mac stood his ground, his expression calm, his shoulders squared. He'd faced worse than this before, but something about this encounter felt personal. "You think you can embarrass us and just walk away?" Derek hissed, his voice low but laced with venom. He jabbed a finger at Mac's chest. "This is our town. You're about to learn what that means." Mac's eyes flicked between the three of them. Derek's fury radiated off him like a fever, while Jake's clenched fists betrayed his impatience. But it was Evan who caught Mac's attention. He lingered behind the others, his steps hesitant, his hands fidgeting at his sides. There was fear in his eyes, not the same bravado-fueled rage as Derek and Jake, but a genuine uncertainty about what was about to happen. "You don't have to do this," Max said, addressing Evan directly. His voice was steady, carrying a weight of authority. "Walk away now, and you won't regret it." Evan's lips parted as if to reply, but Derek's glare silenced him. "Don't listen to him," Derek snapped. "He's bluffing. He's nothing." Jake surged forward first, his boots slamming against the pavement as he closed the distance. His punch came wide and fast, aiming straight for Mac's jaw, but Mac was ready. He sidestepped the swing with practiced ease, grabbing Jake's wrist and twisting it sharply. Jake cried out, his body twisting involuntarily, as Mac forced him off balance and sent him tumbling to the ground with a shove. Derek lunged next, aiming low in an attempt to tackle Mac. The move was clumsy, fueled by desperation rather than skill. Mac planted his feet and braced, catching Derek by the shoulders and driving a knee into his stomach. Derek gasped, the air rushing out of him as he staggered backward, clutching his midsection. "You're out of your depth," Mac said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped back, giving them a moment to reconsider. "Don't make this worse for yourselves." Jake scrambled to his feet, shaking his head as he rubbed his wrist. "You think you're tough because you got lucky?" he spat. "We'll see how tough you are when we're done with you." Evan took another step back, his eyes darting nervously between Mac and Derek. Maybe we should just leave," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Derek snapped, straightening despite the pain evident in his posture. His glare burned into Evan. "You're not chickening out now. Get in there." Evan hesitated, his hands trembling as he took a halting step forward. His gaze met Mac's for a brief moment, and Mac saw the doubt etched in his features. "You don't want this," Mac said again, softer this time. "Walk away. It's not too late." "Move!" Derek barked, shoving Evan forward. But Evan froze, his body refusing to follow orders. His hesitation gave Jake the opening he needed to rush Mac again. This time, his attack was more coordinated, his fists aiming low to avoid Mac's guard. Mac shifted, blocking the blows with his forearms, but Jake's momentum drove them closer to the side of the truck. Mac countered with a sharp elbow to Jake's ribs, forcing him to recoil with a grunt. Before Jake could recover, Mac grabbed him by the shirt and drove him backward into the side of the truck. The metal groaned under the impact, and Jake slumped against it, wheezing for air. Derek growled in frustration and charged again, his fists flying in wild arcs. Max sidestepped one swing and caught Derek's arm mid-strike. Using his opponent's momentum, Mac twisted Derek's arm and shoved him face first into the side of the truck. Derek shouted in pain, struggling to free himself as Mac leaned in close. "Enough," Mac growled, his tone low but cutting. "You've already lost. Stop before this gets worse." But Derek wasn't ready to admit defeat. He shoved backward with all his strength, breaking free of Mac's hold and spinning around. "You think this is over?" Derek spat, his face red with fury. "We'll show you what happens when you mess with us." Evan remained frozen a few feet away, his hands half raised in an indecisive gesture. "Guys, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Evan!" Derek barked, his glare snapping to his youngest accomplice. "If you're too scared, just stay out of the way." Jake groaned, pushing himself off the truck and clutching his side. "We're not done yet," he muttered, his voice low but defiant. The fight paused momentarily, the air thick with tension as the gang regrouped. Max stood in the center, his breathing steady, his eyes scanning their movements. He could see Derek's pride battling with his survival instincts, his fists clenched tightly as he debated his next move. "This is your last chance," Max said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Walk away." Derek wiped the corner of his mouth, his lips curling into a snarl. "Not a chance." And with that, the fight reignited. Derek surged forward with renewed desperation, his movements reckless but filled with fury. Jake flanked him, clutching his ribs but forcing himself upright. Their combined charge forced Mac to shift quickly, his body moving with the precision of someone who'd faced far worse adversaries. Derek swung first, aiming a wild right hook at Mac's head. Mac ducked low, his foot pivoting as he stepped inside Derek's reach. With a sharp, controlled strike to Derek's chest, Mac sent him reeling backward, gasping for air. The blow wasn't meant to maim. It was calculated to remind Derek who he was dealing with. Jake capitalized on the opening, rushing in from the side. This time, he was smarter, aiming low with a driving punch toward Mac's gut. But Mac anticipated the move, sidestepping and catching Jake's wrist mid-swing. With a powerful twist, Mac forced Jake to his knees, eliciting a pained grunt. "You're too predictable," Mac said, his voice calm yet cutting. Jake squirmed, trying to pull free, but Mac shoved him away with a calculated push. Jake tumbled into a parked car, the impact rattling the vehicle. He slumped to the ground, groaning, his earlier bravado completely gone. Derek recovered enough to grab a metal pipe lying near the truck. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white as he swung it wildly. Mac dodged the first strike, the pipe whistling through the air just inches from his head. The second swing came lower, but Mac sidestepped again, his movements fluid and precise. On the third swing, Mac stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He grabbed the pipe with one hand and yanked it free from Derek's grip. The force of the motion sent Derek stumbling forward, off balance. Mac spun the pipe once in his hand before tossing it aside with a loud clang that echoed in the stillness of the street. "You need more than a weapon to take me down," Mac said, his tone unwavering. And even then, it wouldn't be enough. Derek's face twisted with rage, but the hint of fear in his eyes betrayed him. He lunged again, his fists swinging wildly, but his movements were sloppy and uncoordinated. Mac blocked each strike with ease, his forearms absorbing the blows like they were nothing. Then, with a calculated uppercut, Mac sent Derek sprawling to the ground. Derek lay there for a moment, clutching his jaw as he glared up at Mac. His breath came in ragged gasps, his earlier confidence shattered. "You done?" Mac asked, his voice steady, almost casual. But before Derek could answer, Jake pushed himself off the ground and charged once more. His steps were sluggish, his body clearly battered, but his pride pushed him forward. Mac caught him mid-charge, planting a firm hand on Jake's chest and shoving him backward. Jake stumbled, tripped over the curb, and landed flat on his back, groaning. Evan stood frozen near the truck, his hands hovering indecisively. His eyes darted between his two fallen companions and Mac, the fear in his expression palpable. "Evan," Mac said, his voice softer now, though it still carried the weight of authority, "you don't have to be a part of this. Walk away." Evan swallowed hard, his trembling hands lowering slightly. I don't want this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Then leave," Mac said. "Now." Evan hesitated for only a moment longer before nodding. He took a shaky step backward, then another, before turning and jogging away into the night. Derek, still lying on the ground, shouted after him. "Coward!" Derek spat, his voice hoarse. "You're dead, Evan! You hear me?" Mac's attention returned to Derek as he crouched down, his large frame looming over the gang leader. "You've been beaten," Mac said, his tone cold and deliberate. "Take the loss. Walk away. Don't make this worse." Derek's glare burned with humiliation, but he didn't move to attack again. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his movements stiff and pained. He glanced at Jake, who was still sprawled on the curb, and cursed under his breath. "You'll regret this," Derek said, his voice trembling but full of venom. "We know where you live. This isn't over." Mac stood tall, his expression unchanging. "Try it," he replied evenly, "and you'll see just how over it is." Derek grabbed Jake's arm, hauling him to his feet. Together, they limped down the street, their voices low as they muttered curses and threats. Mac watched them go, his chest rising and falling steadily as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. He didn't relax until the street fell silent once more. The fight was over, but the battle wasn't. Derek's threats hung in the air, promising more trouble to come. Mac turned toward his house, his thoughts already turning to the next steps. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what he'd faced tonight. The night was quiet as Mac sat in his living room, nursing a cup of coffee. The fight still replayed in his mind. The wild swings, the threats, and, most importantly, Evan's hesitation. The youngest of the trio hadn't truly committed to the confrontation, and his retreat had spoken volumes. Evan was scared. Not of Mac, but of Derek. Mac leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. If Derek and his gang were going to be dismantled, it wouldn't be by brute force alone. Fear had kept the town silent for too long. Mac needed someone on the inside, someone who could reveal everything. And he knew just who that someone was. The next morning, Mac parked his truck near the auto parts store where Evan worked. He waited patiently, his marine instincts kicking in as he observed the building. When Evan finally stepped out, shoulders hunched and a wary glance darting around, Mac made his move. "Evan!" Mac called, his voice calm but firm. Evan froze mid-step, his head snapping toward Mac. His wide eyes betrayed his nerves as Mac approached, his hands held out in a non-threatening manner. "I'm not here to hurt you," Mac said, stopping a few feet away. "I just want to talk." Evan hesitated, his gaze shifting toward his car as though considering a quick escape. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know what I want," Mac replied. "I want the truth. About Derek, about everything he's done, and I think you want to give it." Evan laughed nervously, shaking his head. "You don't get it. Derek will kill me if I talk." Mac's expression didn't waver. "And what happens if you don't? You think he's going to protect you when this falls apart? Or do you think he'll use you as a scapegoat?" Evan flinched, his hands clenching into fists. "You don't know what you're asking. He's connected. His dad, his uncle, they own this town." "They don't own me," Mac said firmly. "And they don't own you either. You have a chance to do the right thing, to walk away from this." Evan looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't have a choice." "You do now," Mac said, stepping closer. His voice softened, but it still carried an edge of determination. "You've seen what Derek's done to this town, to those families he's driven out. Do you really want to be a part of that? Or do you want to fix it?" Evan swallowed hard, his gaze flicking back up to meet Mac's. "What are you asking me to do?" "Tell the truth," Mac said, Confess to everything. Work with me to bring him down." Evan hesitated, his body trembling as he wrestled with the weight of the decision. Mac stayed silent, giving him the space he needed to think. Finally, Evan nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "But if I do this, you have to promise me he won't come after me." "You have my word," Mac said. "You're doing the right thing." Later that evening, Evan sat nervously at Mac's dining table, his hands gripping a cup of coffee as though it were a lifeline. Mac sat across from him, a recorder placed between them. "Just start from the beginning," Mac said. "What Derek's done. Who's been involved. Everything." Evan took a deep breath and began to talk. The words came slowly at first, but once he started, they poured out like a flood. He described how Derek and Jake had recruited him, using intimidation and promises of protection. He detailed the vandalism, the threats, the families they had driven out. He explained how Derek's father and uncle had helped cover up their actions, using their influence to silence complaints and quash investigations. Mac listened intently, his jaw tightening as the full scope of the gang's operation came to light. This wasn't just a group of thugs. It was a network of power and fear, entrenched in every corner of the town. By the time Evan finished, he looked exhausted, his shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted from him. "What now?" he asked quietly. "Now we take this to the right people," Mac said. "The press, the authorities, anyone who will listen, and we make sure they can't ignore it." Evan nodded, his expression conflicted but resolute. "Okay, just promise me you'll keep me out of this as much as you can." "I'll do my best," Mac said. "But you need to be ready. Derek's not going to go down quietly." Evan swallowed hard but nodded again. "I'm in." That night, Mac reviewed the recording, his mind racing with the possibilities. With Evan's confession, he had enough to start breaking Derek's hold on the town. But this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and Mac knew the hardest part was still to come. As he shut off the recorder and leaned back in his chair, a faint smile crossed his face. For the first time, it felt like the tide was starting to turn. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mac's living room as he prepared for the next phase of his plan. Evan's confession was a goldmine of information, a roadmap detailing Derek's operation and the web of intimidation, fear, and corruption that kept it running. But a confession alone wasn't enough. Mac needed to turn the town against Derek, to make sure no one could ignore the truth anymore. His first stop was the office of Eric Martin, a local journalist who had earned a reputation for poking around in the town's quieter corners. Eric was young, maybe late 20s, and his nervous energy was evident as Mac stepped into his modest office. "You again," Eric said, standing from his desk. "What's this about now?" Mac placed a folder on Eric's desk and tapped it once. "This is about the truth. You want a story that matters? Here it is." Eric opened the folder and scanned the pages, his brows furrowing deeper with every line. His hand paused when Mac handed him a recorder. "What's this?" "Evan. He's confessed everything. Vandalism, threats, Derek's connections, all of it. Play it." Eric hesitated, then pressed the play button. Evan's shaky voice filled the room, recounting incident after incident. Mac watched as the journalist's face shifted from cautious curiosity to disbelief, and, finally, anger. "This," Eric stopped the recording and leaned back in his chair. "This is big." "It's more than big," Mac said. "This is your chance to expose what's been happening here. People need to know they're not alone, that Derek and his crew can't keep running this town." Eric nodded slowly, his earlier hesitancy melting away. "I'll need to fact-check some of this, but if it holds up, I'll run it. And I'll push it to regional outlets. This story won't stay local." "Good," Mac said, standing to leave. "The more people know, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug." Mac's next stop was the police station. He'd seen their indifference before, but this time he wasn't walking in empty-handed. With a copy of Evan's confession and a detailed summary of Derek's activities, Mac intended to force their hand. The desk officer, a man in his 40s with a tired face, looked up as Mac approached. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak to someone in charge of investigations," Mac said firmly. After a moment of hesitation, The officer nodded. A few minutes later, Mac was seated across from Detective Collins, a grizzled man whose skeptical gaze rested heavily on the folder Mac slid across the desk. "This better be good," Collins muttered as he opened the folder. "It's more than good," Mac said. "It's proof." Collins flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "Evan Knight, huh?" he said, stopping at the transcript of the confession. "He's one of Derek's boys." "Not anymore," Mac replied. "He's ready to testify." Collins leaned back, crossing his arms. "You've got a lot here, but you know how this works. Evidence doesn't mean much if the people pulling the strings are still in power. That's why I came to you," Mac said, his voice steady. "If you want to do your job, you've got what you need. If not, I'll take this to someone who will." Collins's jaw tightened, but after a moment, he nodded. "Leave this with me. I'll see what I can do." As Mac left the station, he knew the detective's response wasn't a guarantee, but it was a step forward, and that was enough for now. The ripple effect of Evan's confession started quickly. Within days, whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs became full conversations. People began talking, quietly at first, then more boldly, about what they'd endured at the hands of Derek and his crew. Mac walked through town and saw the change. A business owner who had avoided eye contact with him a week ago now stopped to thank him. A neighbor who'd been silent since Mac moved in pulled him aside to share his own story about Derek's threats. "I always thought no one would care," the man admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But seeing you stand up to him, maybe it's time we all did." Mac nodded, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "The more people speak out, the less power they have. We do this together." By the end of the week, the town was buzzing. Eric's article hit the local paper, the headline bold and uncompromising. "Small town, big secrets. The reign of Derek Hastings and his crew." The story laid bare the gang's crimes, their connections, and the complicity of those who'd turned a blind eye. The response was immediate. Business owners and residents began coming forward with their own stories, adding to the growing pressure on Derek and his allies. For the first time, the tide felt like it was turning. But Mac knew it wasn't over. Derek wasn't the type to sit back and accept defeat. The next move would be his, and Mac would be ready. Mac sat on his porch, the evening air thick with anticipation. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Detective Collins. "Warrants signed. We're moving in tonight. Be ready if we need you." Mac read the message twice before standing and stretching. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It was resolve. This was the moment they'd been working toward. He grabbed his jacket and stepped off the porch, heading toward his truck. He wanted to be there when it happened. The scene was set at Derek's usual haunt, a run-down garage on the outskirts of town that doubled as their base of operations. Mac parked a few streets away, his vantage point offering a clear view of the police assembling near the garage. Their movements were deliberate, a mix of uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives positioning themselves strategically. Detective Collins stepped out of an unmarked car, speaking into his radio. His gaze swept the area before locking on Mac's truck. Mac climbed out and approached, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You didn't have to come," Collins said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not here to get in the way," Mac replied, "but I've been in this fight long enough. I want to see it through." Collins nodded, glancing back toward the garage. "They're all in there. Derek, Jake, and the others. We're going in hard and fast." Mac folded his arms, his sharp eyes fixed on the garage. "Make sure you get them all. No one slips through." Collins didn't reply, but the determination in his expression said enough. He raised his hand, signaling to the officers nearby. The faint hum of radios crackled to life, and the officers moved into position. The first shout came from the front of the garage. "Police! Open up!" The words echoed through the night, punctuated by the heavy pounding of fists against the metal door. Inside, there was a scramble of movement, a crash of overturned furniture, muffled curses, and frantic voices. Mac stood back, his muscles tensing as he watched the scene unfold. The door finally gave way with a loud clang, and officers poured into the building, their voices commanding and sharp. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" From his vantage point, Mac saw Derek stumble out of the shadows, his hands half raised as his eyes darted wildly around the room. The bravado was gone, replaced by panic. Jake followed, his face pale, his shoulders hunched as he dropped to his knees without resistance. Two other men hesitated, their hands hovering mid-air, before an officer barked another order. "Down! Now!" Mac shifted his stance, watching closely as Derek tried to regain some semblance of control. "You don't know who you're messing with," Derek shouted, his voice cracking as officers moved in to cuff him. "You think this will stick? My dad's already making calls. You're all dead." Collins stepped into the frame, his expression calm but unyielding. "Your dad's not here, Derek, and no one's listening to him anymore." Derek glared at him, his face twisting with rage. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" "It is for you," Collins replied, signaling for the officers to haul Derek out. Jake and the others followed, their heads bowed as they were led to waiting patrol cars. Mac remained at the edge of the scene, his arms crossed as he observed the arrests. He caught Derek's eye as the young man was shoved into the back of a squad car. For a moment, Derek's mask of fury slipped, revealing the fear beneath. Mac didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. Collins approached, wiping his brow as the officers began securing the scene. "That's all of them," he said, his tone edged with exhaustion. "Good," Mac replied, his gaze still on the patrol cars. "Now make it count. Don't let this get buried." Collins nodded. "We've got enough to hold them. Evan's testimony, the complaints, and the evidence you handed over. Their family's going to push back hard, but we'll push harder." Mac turned to face him fully. "You've got the whole town watching now. Make sure they see justice." Collins extended a hand, and Mac shook it firmly. "You've done a lot," Collins said. "More than most. I just did what needed to be done," Mac replied. As the patrol cars drove away, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness, Mac let out a slow breath. The arrests were a step forward, but the fight wasn't over. Derek's family still held sway in the town, and there would be fallout. But for now, the tide had turned. Mac walked back to his truck, his mind already turning to the next phase. Derek's reign of terror was over, but Mac wouldn't rest until the entire system that enabled him was dismantled. The sun rose over the town the next morning, bathing the streets in golden light. But for many, the day was anything but ordinary. The arrests of Derek and his gang had sent ripples through the community, and the fallout was immediate. Mac stood at the edge of the diner parking lot, watching the morning crowd shuffle in. Conversations buzzed around him, their tones hushed but urgent. "You hear about Derek?" one man whispered to another as they passed Mac. "They got him, Jake, and 2 others last night." "About time," the other replied. "But his dad's not going to let this slide." Mac crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. He wasn't naive. Derek's family wouldn't just sit back and accept defeat. But he also knew the arrests had given people something they hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, the town was seeing that the gang wasn't untouchable. At the police station, Detective Collins was already knee-deep in the chaos. Phone calls from Derek's father's legal team flooded his desk, each one more aggressive than the last. Collins barely looked up when Mac entered the room. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest," Collins said, gesturing for Mac to sit. "Good," Mac replied, lowering himself into the chair. "The more noise they make, the guiltier they look." Collins smirked, though his expression quickly grew serious. "The DA's on board, but we're going to need more to make this stick. Derek's dad is throwing everything he has at this, and the pressure's coming down hard. You've got the confession, the evidence, and witnesses coming forward," Mac said. "What else do you need?" "Support," Collins admitted. "Public opinion matters in cases like this. If the town backs us, it'll be harder for them to wriggle out of it." Mac leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Then you'll get it. People are tired of being afraid." By midday, the town square was alive with activity. Mac stood near the steps of the community center as a crowd began to gather. Eric Martin, the young journalist who'd run the first story on Derek, stood nearby, jotting notes into his notebook. The arrests had only fueled the town's willingness to speak out, And more stories were surfacing. Stories of intimidation, property damage, and blatant threats. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. For years, they've been tearing this town apart. My shop was vandalized 3 times last year. And every time I went to the police, nothing happened. It's about time someone did something. A man in his 40s nodded in agreement. They slashed my tires when I refused to donate to their so-called fundraisers. I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to them. Mac listened quietly, his presence a steadying force for those speaking. When the murmurs began to quiet, he stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the crowd. "This isn't just about Derek or his gang," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This is about the people who let it happen, the ones who turned a blind eye because it was easier than doing the right thing. That ends now. But it only ends if we keep pushing." There were murmurs of agreement, and Eric scribbled furiously in his notebook. Mac's words weren't just about the past. They were a challenge to the future. Meanwhile, back at Derek's family estate, the Hastings patriarch was livid. Robert Hastings paced his opulent study, his phone glued to his ear as he berated his lawyer. "I don't care what it takes," he barked. "Get my son out of that cell, and find out who's behind this. No one embarrasses my family like this and gets away with it." Derek sat in a chair nearby, his arms crossed and his face pale. The swagger he'd carried so effortlessly was gone, replaced by unease. "They can't keep us in there," he muttered, more to himself than to his father. "Dad'll fix it." But Robert's threats and bribes were hitting a wall. The growing public pressure, combined with the mounting evidence, was making it harder for even him to manipulate the situation. And for the first time, Derek was beginning to understand that his father's influence might not be enough. By the time evening fell, the town was buzzing with renewed energy. People were talking openly now, their fear replaced by determination. Mac returned to his porch, watching as neighbors walked past with nods of gratitude or quiet smiles. For years, they'd been silenced by fear. Now, their voices were growing louder. Detective Collins arrived just as the streetlights flickered on. He stepped out of his car, his expression weary but resolute. "Thought you'd want an update," he said, joining Mac on the porch. "What's the word?" Mac asked. "We've got Derek and Jake locked up. The other 2 are being processed," Collins said. "The DA's confident, but we're not out of the woods yet. Derek's father is pushing hard." Mac nodded slowly. "Let him push. He'll only dig the hole deeper." Collins smirked faintly, glancing at the quiet street. "You really lit a fire under this town." "They lit it themselves," Mac replied. "I just gave them a reason." Collins clapped him on the shoulder before heading back to his car. Mac stayed on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the town had a fighting chance. And he wasn't going to stop until it was won. The tension in the town grew thicker with each passing day. Derek's arrest had shaken the status quo, but the Hastings family wasn't taking it lying down. Rumors spread like wildfire. Stories of bribes, backroom deals, and veiled threats aimed at shutting down the investigation. Mac knew this wasn't just about Derek anymore. It was about dismantling the power his family wielded over the town. The morning after Collins's update, Mac received a call from Eric Martin, the journalist who had been documenting everything. "You're going to want to see this," Eric said, his voice urgent. "Hastings is making his move." "What kind of move?" Mac asked, already pulling on his boots. "Press conference at City Hall," Eric replied. "He's going on the offensive." The crowd outside City Hall was larger than Mac had anticipated. Dozens of reporters, residents, and a few council members gathered around a makeshift podium. At the center of it all stood Robert Hastings, his tailored suit and silver hair gleaming under the midday sun. Flanked by a team of lawyers, he radiated confidence, his posture commanding as he approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "This past week has been a shameful display of overreach and baseless accusations. My son, Derek, has been wrongfully accused, and I will not stand idly by while his reputation is dragged through the mud. The crowd murmured, a mix of support and skepticism rippling through the onlookers. Mac stood near the back, his arms crossed, his expression unyielding as he listened. Robert continued, his tone sharpening. These so-called charges are part of a smear campaign orchestrated by outsiders who don't understand this town or its people. My family has dedicated generations to this community, and we will not be intimidated by false narratives. Mac's jaw tightened. The spin was blatant, but it was working. Some members of the crowd nodded in agreement, their loyalty to the Hastings name still intact. Mac stepped forward slightly, catching Eric's eye. The journalist was furiously scribbling notes, his brow furrowed. "And to those who think they can use fear to undermine us," Robert added, his voice rising, "know this, we will fight back, and we will win." As the press conference ended, Mac moved quickly through the dispersing crowd to where Eric was standing. "They're doubling down," Mac said, his tone low but firm. "They're trying to control the narrative," Eric replied, tucking his notebook into his bag. "But people are starting to question them. Did you see the looks on some of the council members' faces? They're rattled." Mac nodded. "Good. Now, we need to keep the pressure on." Eric glanced around before leaning in closer. "There's more. I've been digging into the council's records. Hastings' uncle has been funneling money through shell accounts tied to town projects. If we can link it to Derek's operation, it'll blow the whole thing wide open." "How long do you need?" Mac asked. "Not long," Eric said, "but I'll need someone to corroborate it." "Evan," Mac said immediately. "He's already confessed to everything else. If he knows about the money, he'll talk." That evening, Mac met with Evan at the community center. The young man looked tired, his shoulders hunched as he nursed a bottle of water. He glanced up nervously when Mac approached. "I heard about the press conference," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Derek's dad isn't going to stop, is he?" "No," Mac replied, sitting across from him. "But neither are we." Evan's eyes flicked to the ground, his hands fidgeting with the bottle. "What do you need from me?" "Eric found something," Mac said. "Money trails linked to town projects. If Derek's dad and uncle are involved, we need you to confirm it." Evan hesitated, his jaw working as he weighed his options. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. But if they find out, they won't," Mac assured him. "And if they try, they'll have to go through me first." The following morning, Mac sat with Detective Collins in his office at the station. Eric's findings and Evan's corroboration had provided the missing piece they needed. Collins looked over the documents spread across his desk, his expression grim. "This changes things," Collins said finally. "If we can prove the money trail ties back to Robert Hastings, it's not just Derek on the line, it's the whole family." "So what's the move?" Mac asked. "We bring this to the DA," Collins replied, "and then we go public." Mac nodded, his determination unwavering. "Let's finish this." By the afternoon, the town was abuzz again, but this time the tide was turning even further. Eric's latest article exposed the financial corruption, naming names and pointing directly at Robert and his brother. Coupled with the arrests and mounting testimony, the Hastings family's grip on the town was slipping fast. Robert's confident facade cracked as reporters pressed him for comments outside his estate. Derek's usual arrogance was nowhere to be seen as he was paraded before the cameras, flanked by officers escorting him to a hearing. And, throughout it all, Mac remained steady, watching as the town began to reclaim its voice. But Mac knew the fight wasn't over yet. The Hastings family wouldn't go down without a fight, and the courtroom battles ahead would test everyone involved. Still, for the first time, victory felt within reach. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people filed into the gallery, murmurs filling the air like static. The town's most powerful family was finally being dragged into the spotlight, and everyone wanted to see how it would play out. Mac took a seat near the back, his calm demeanor masking the fire in his chest. This wasn't just about Derek anymore. This was about sending a message to the Hastings family and everyone who had enabled their reign of terror. At the front of the courtroom, Derek sat flanked by his high-powered defense attorneys, his smug expression barely masking his unease. Robert Hastings sat nearby, his usual commanding presence diminished by the gravity of the charges his son now faced. To Mac, they looked smaller than they ever had. Two men desperately trying to hold on to their crumbling empire. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Knight, approached the podium, her voice clear and steady as she began her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we will present irrefutable evidence of the crimes committed by Derek Hastings and his accomplices. Evidence that not only implicates them in acts of harassment, vandalism, and assault, but also reveals a deeper network of corruption tied directly to this family's influence in our town." She gestured toward the table where Derek and his lawyers sat. For too long, the Hastings name has been synonymous with power and impunity. But today, that ends. Today, we take a stand. The gallery erupted into whispers, but the judge's gavel quickly restored order. Valerie's words had set the tone. This trial wasn't just about justice for Derek's victims. It was about dismantling the legacy that had allowed him to operate unchecked. The trial unfolded methodically, each piece of evidence building on the last. Mac watched intently as Valerie called her first witness, Evan. The young man looked nervous as he approached the stand, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been waiting years to tell the truth. "I was part of Derek's crew," Evan admitted, his eyes fixed on the prosecutor. "I went along with it because I was scared. Of him, of his dad, of what they could do if I didn't. But it wasn't just about us messing around. Derek had his father's backing. We did things because we knew no one would stop us." The courtroom fell silent as Evan described the vandalism, the threats, the way they targeted people who didn't belong. His testimony was raw, unflinching, and it painted Derek as more than a bully. He was a man who used his family's power to terrorize a town. When Valerie asked about the financial trail, Evan hesitated, glancing briefly at Robert Hastings. The older man's glare was ice-cold, but Mac's steady gaze from the gallery seemed to ground Evan. "There were payments," Evan continued, his voice stronger now. "Money from fake invoices, donations to projects that never happened. Derek's uncle handled most of it, but everyone knew it was to keep people quiet or make them go away." As the prosecution continued to build its case, Derek's defense scrambled to counter. His lead attorney, a polished man with a silver tongue, tried to paint Derek as a misunderstood youth, claiming the charges were exaggerated and driven by a vendetta against the Hastings family. "This is nothing more than a witch hunt," the defense attorney argued, his voice slick with practiced confidence. "My client is being scapegoated for the mistakes of others, and the prosecution has failed to provide concrete proof tying him to these accusations." But Valerie was ready. She called victim after victim to the stand. Business owners, former residents, even longtime locals who had been too afraid to speak out before. Each testimony was another nail in Derek's coffin, and with every word, the gallery grew more restless. When it was Mac's turn to testify, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He walked to the stand with the same calm, unyielding presence he had carried throughout the entire ordeal. Valerie's questions were direct, focusing on his role in exposing Derek's crimes. "You provided evidence to the police," Valerie said. "What motivated you to take that step?" Mac's gaze swept over the gallery before settling on Valerie. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "This town had been living under their shadow for too long. People were scared, but they shouldn't have to be. I just gave them the chance to stand up." Derek's attorney tried to rattle him during cross-examination, but Mac's calm responses turned every question back on itself, leaving little room for doubt. By the time he stepped down, the tide felt undeniable. By the end of the day, the jury looked weary but resolute as they filed out to deliberate. Mac left the courtroom, stepping into the crisp evening air. The trial wasn't over yet, but the prosecution had laid everything bare. For the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. Detective Collins caught up to him outside, a rare grin on his face. "You've done a hell of a thing, Davis. Whether they convict him or not, you've changed this town." Mac nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's not about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." As the courthouse lights flickered on, Mac leaned against the railing, waiting for the verdict that would determine whether the fight was truly over. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats. The weight of the trial hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Mac sat in the gallery, his broad shoulders tense, his hands gripping the edge of the bench in front of him. This was it, the moment that would decide whether all the work, the risks, and the sacrifices had been worth it. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Once seated again, the foreperson of the jury stood, holding the verdict in her hands. She looked calm but pale, as though the gravity of what she was about to announce had weighed on her heavily. "On the charge of harassment," she began, her voice clear but steady, "we find the defendant, Derek Hastings, guilty." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Mac exhaled slowly, but didn't move. The foreperson continued. "On the charge of vandalism, we find the defendant, Derek Hastings, guilty." Derek's face was a mask of anger and disbelief. His lawyers whispered furiously in his ear, but he batted them away, his expression darkening with each word from the foreperson's mouth. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Derek Hastings, guilty." The tension in the room broke like a dam. Quiet cheers and muffled gasps of relief rippled through the gallery. Mac leaned back in his seat, his eyes steady on Derek, who now sat slumped, his head in his hands. The sentencing followed shortly after. The judge, an older man with a stern gaze, looked over the courtroom as he prepared to deliver the punishment. "Derek Hastings," he said, his voice firm and unyielding, "your actions have caused harm not only to individuals, but to the very fabric of this community. The evidence presented against you is overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims paint a picture of a man who believed himself untouchable. That ends today." Derek stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, as the judge continued. "For the charges of harassment, vandalism, and assault, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to your victims, as outlined by the prosecution." A gasp went up from Derek's mother, who sat in the front row. Robert Hastings, seated beside her, looked as though he'd been struck. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. Mac caught his gaze for a brief moment before Robert turned away. Jake and the other accomplices faced lesser charges, but their sentences were harsh enough to ensure they wouldn't return to their old ways anytime soon. Jake received 5 years, while the other 2 got 3 each. As they were led from the courtroom, Mac noticed how much smaller they seemed now, their swagger and confidence drained. But it wasn't just the gang-facing consequences. The prosecution had already begun laying the groundwork for financial investigations into Robert Hastings and his brother. While they hadn't been formally charged yet, their business dealings were now under intense scrutiny, and the weight of public opinion was beginning to shift. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Reporters jostled for space, their microphones and cameras pointed at anyone who might give them a soundbite. Mac stepped out into the chaos, his presence drawing attention almost immediately. "Mr. Davis," one reporter called out, pushing a microphone toward him. "What do you have to say about the verdict?" Mac paused, his expression calm but resolute. "Justice was served today," he said simply. "But this isn't just about one man or one trial. It's about making sure no one else has to live in fear in this town. And we're not done yet." The reporters peppered him with more questions, but Mac pushed through the crowd, his focus on the people who mattered most. A group of business owners and residents who had come to support the trial stood near the courthouse steps, their faces a mix of relief and determination. "You did it," Sandra said, stepping forward. Her smile was small but genuine. "You gave this town a chance to fight back." "We all did," Mac replied. "This was never about just me." As the crowd began to disperse, Mac felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Detective Collins, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the faintest hint of a smile. "Not bad, Davis," Collins said. "Not bad at all." "It's not over," Mac replied, his tone even. "The Hastings family still has a lot to answer for." Collins nodded. "True. But today was a start. You should take a minute to enjoy it." Mac gave a small nod, though he knew there was still work to be done. The Hastings family's influence might be weakened, but it wasn't gone. Still, for the first time, the town had hope. And that was enough. That night, Mac sat on his porch, the stars overhead shining brighter than they had in weeks. The fight wasn't over, but the battle had been won. For the first time, the town felt like a place worth fighting for. And as long as there was work to be done, Mac knew he'd be there to see it through. The days following the trial were quieter than Mac expected. The town had changed, though not entirely. It was more like a wound that had started to heal. Derek and his crew were behind bars, and the Hastings family's influence was under a spotlight it couldn't avoid. People moved differently now. There was still caution, but there was also something else: hope. Mac stood in the community center's small gym, resetting a bench after finishing his routine. Across the room, Sandra and a few others chatted near the bulletin board, their voices lighter than he'd ever heard them. Notices for town meetings, small business fairs, and even a celebration of resilience event peppered the board. A far cry from the fear and silence that had once stifled this place. Sandra approached as Mac wiped his hands on a towel. "You're staying, aren't you?" she asked, her tone casual, but the question carried weight. Mac looked at her, then glanced around the room. He had thought about leaving. After all, he'd come here as an outsider, and now that the fight against Derek and his family was over, or at least well underway, he had no obligation to stay. But seeing the town rebuild itself, seeing people finding their voices again, made it hard to walk away. "Yeah," he said finally, his deep voice steady. "I think I'll stick around." Sandra smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. "Good. We need people like you." Mac didn't respond.